So let me welcome all of you to our very first virtual Gloria Kaufman Memorial Lecture. And my name is Christina Gherkin. I'm the director of the Women's and Gender Studies program here at IU South Bend. And this is actually the 16th year that we have hosted this event and invited a speaker. Last year, the Gloria Kaufman Memorial Lecture and the installation of the IU historical marker were one of the last in-person events on our campus before we shut down due to COVID-19. And I'm sure at the time, none of us imagined that we would still be here at this point doing things virtually. But here we are, and we're absolutely thrilled that we're nonetheless able to host this event and continue with this lecture series this year. And even though I'm not actually able to see everyone's face, it has really been great to see so many people and familiar names register for this event. So thank you everybody for being here tonight. And we'll begin with a few introductory remarks, and then we're going to have Dr. Téllez give her lecture, and there's going to be some time for Q&A in the end. But for right now, let me turn over the virtual podium, or really the screen, to our new Executive Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, Dr. Jill Perrin.
Thank you, Dr. Gherkin. Hello, everyone. I am Jill Perrin, the Executive Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs here at Indiana University South Bend. And it is my pleasure to welcome you today to the virtual IUSB campus and to this year's Gloria Kaufman Memorial Lecture. We're really glad you're here. This lecture series was established in 2005 to honor Gloria Kaufman, who was a member of the IU South Bend faculty from 1967 to 1993. During her tenure, Gloria established the campus's first Women's Resource Center, served as the Affirmative Action Officer, and founded the Women's Studies program. She was also an active scholar and filmmaker, publishing articles, anthologies, as well as writing and directing multiple documentaries. Her significance to and impact on this campus was so substantial that she was honored almost exactly a year ago with the installation of the historical marker in front of the library that Dr. Gherkin already mentioned. It's a very big deal, and I'm so excited that this is so close to that year anniversary. It's a very exciting thing. Her first Women's Studies course included a series of open guest lectures, and she continued over the years to bring significant women speakers to campus. So it is such an honor to be here as we celebrate the legacy of Dr. Kaufman through this series. I am going to go ahead and hand that virtual mic back to you, Dr. Gherkin, so you can introduce our guest and we can get right to the lecture that we've all come here to hear.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perrin. So very briefly, let me just say what an honor it is to serve as the director of the Women's and Gender Studies program here on our campus. We currently have over 60 active majors and minors, and this semester alone, over 230 students are taking classes in Women's and Gender Studies. And really, as Dr. Perrin already said, none of this would have been possible without the vision of Gloria Kaufman, who is the founder of our program here on campus. She was a dynamic scholar, a campus leader, and a feminist community builder whose vision we continue to uphold today. And after she passed away in 2004, students and friends created a foundation gift to sponsor an annual speaker of national reputation to address a topic of interest in the field of women's studies. This talk tonight is made possible by this foundation and also by many supporters here on our campus. We want to offer a heartfelt thank you to the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and especially to our Dean, Brenda Phillips, the School of Social Work, and the College of Health Sciences. Other campus co-sponsors include the Departments of English, Psychology, Philosophy, Sociology and Anthropology, Political Science, and Criminal Justice, and the programs in Sustainability, General Studies, the Master of Liberal Studies, and of course, Women's and Gender Studies. A special thank you also goes out to the Civil Rights Heritage Center, and especially to George Garner, who has done all of the technology for tonight and who's making sure that everything is running smoothly here. And our program continues to thrive in no small part because of support from the community, which has allowed us to offer a $2,500 scholarship for a Women's and Gender Studies major every year. We're particularly proud of our graduates who are spreading the mission of our program far beyond our campus, working in education and health advocacy, reproductive rights, and enriching our community in myriad ways. And it's great to know that so many of our alumni are here tonight, so thank you for being here. I also want to recognize the work of Dr. Niovi Karakatsanis and Dr. Kathy Borshok, who organized an event with our Kaufman speaker this morning for honor students. And that was really a great start to the day, lots of great participation. I'm really looking forward to learning more about the research. But before I introduce our wonderful speaker for today, just a few brief housekeeping items. So first of all, we will be recording this lecture and it will be available on the YouTube channel of the Civil Rights Heritage Center. With the webinar format, the people in the audience won't be able to turn on their camera or their mic. However, we would like to invite all of you to post comments and questions into the Q&A. So there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we will make sure that we will leave some time after the lecture to ask questions. So please feel free to post throughout the lecture as you think of questions, and then we'll make sure to get to as many of them as possible at the end of the talk. And now it is my distinct honor to introduce this year's Kaufman speaker, Dr. Michelle Téllez. And really, since her time as an undergraduate at UCLA, as we learned this morning, Dr. Téllez has committed her life to advancing social justice and mapping projects of resistance. She's coming to us tonight, virtually, from the University of Arizona, where she's an assistant professor of Mexican American Studies. Dr. Téllez writes about transnational community building, Chicana feminism, and gendered migrations. She's the editor of the Chicana Motherwork Anthology, which was published in 2019, and is currently working on a monograph titled Autonomy in the Spaces of Neoliberal Neglect, The Woman of Marclavio Rojas, which is expected to appear in print later this year. As part of an international team of researchers, Dr. Téllez is also working on a grant-funded project about COVID-19's differential impact on the mental and emotional health of Indigenous people. In addition to her academic writing, she is a very prolific writer, Dr. Téllez has an extraordinary record of community scholarship and has been involved in the production of films, podcasts, and blogs. She is a founding member of the Chicana Motherhood Collective, the Arizona Binational Arts Residency Program, and the San Jaroko Collective. Dr. Téllez has been engaged in many grassroots projects where she has used community-based arts, performance, and visual media to transform communities and bring attention to the issues that migrants and Indigenous peoples face in the state of Arizona and beyond. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Michelle Téllez.
Thank you. Well, I'm so honored with that wonderful welcome. Let me share my screen and so that we can get started. Okay. So good evening. It is such an honor to be with you all virtually. I'm here on Tohono O'odham land, also known as Tucson, Arizona. I want to thank all of the people that you all just mentioned, especially the Women's and Gender Studies program, Dr. Gerken, and the Civil Rights Heritage Center for their gracious invitation. And of course, my appreciation extends to all the people and programs that have been unnamed who made this event possible. I also want to add that I received an incredible welcome via email from the family of Gloria Kaufman, and I cannot express how much that meant to me. What a privilege it is to be in conversation with you all, with this community, and for your commitment to this work. One of my hopes for tonight is to have us consider collectively the possibilities for change when we allow ourselves to dream, to build, and to imagine. So I grew up along the border city of San Diego, which is adjacent to Tijuana, Mexico. The experiences of racialized and cultural exclusions sharply defined who I became as a scholar, a writer, a teacher, an activist, a community member, and a mother. Therefore, home for me is the borderlands, and my persona has been deeply shaped by this transfronteriza or transborder experience, which in turn has determined the kind of work that I do, that I offer, that I'm compelled to collaborate around. Ultimately, because I find value in public pedagogy, in embedded praxis, in cultural arts production, and in producing knowledge with and about communities who are embodying creation resistance. I am a Chicana transfronteriza. My mother was from a small town in the state of Jalisco, Mexico. Tomatlan is the name of the town. And my father was born and raised in Chicago, but his family also came from the same state in Mexico. So my transborder experience shapes my work as an interdisciplinary scholar of Chicanx studies. So I use the concept of transfronteriza or transborderness in my work in three ways. First, I use it to illustrate my personal history as a border dweller negotiating the US-Mexico border and the tensions created from belonging neither here nor there. Not only did I grow up crossing and recrossing the gendered, class, and racialized borders that were placed on me, but I also navigated the actual international demarcation between San Diego and Tijuana regularly. As opposed to choosing lados or sides, I eventually came to understand that my life and experiences could only be understood from this transborder experience or perspective, one that disrupts the border as a line of separation. I also use transfronteriza to describe my role as a researcher who examines the effects of transnational policies and companies on US-Mexico border communities. Third, I use the concept of transfronteriza as a generative one that will help us better understand the ways in which border women dwellers are responding to transnational processes and the effects of neoliberal policies. I argue that the actual US-Mexico border should not just be seen as a site of passage, but also as a site for gendered transformation where politicized transfronteriza identity can emerge, and as a place where we can understand what Rebecca Citrons calls the everyday revolutions in social relationships. So my talk, Beyond the Wall, Fronteriza Imaginaries, is an invitation to disrupt normative discourses around the border, to think beyond the geopolitical demarcation of the US-Mexico border, to ask how we can imagine the borderlands as a space of resistance, conviviality, agents, creative community building, and one that differs from the rhetoric of invasion, crime, insecurity, violence, and illegality that is popularized in the media. The research and stories that I'll share today are rooted in experiential knowledge and many years of community-based rooted research in the region. I want to begin with a mapping of the border region to provide some context to my talk. So this is an image of the 2,000-mile-long stretch. I showed this earlier today. And the border as we know it today, of course, was formed only 170 years ago with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Gadsden Purchase. Now, I say only because when I think of my students here in my classes in Tucson, many of them have been in the region for up to 8 generations, which means that these families have been here since before the establishment of the border, right? However, the divide became associated with a set of practices of inclusion and exclusion affecting communities on both sides of the boundary and as apparatus of genocidal warfare that might be most apparent on the Tohono O'odham Nation, located in what is now known as the states of Arizona and Sonora. The US-Mexico border traces a violent line across O'odham land, destroying an ancestral crossing point that involves not only families, but also the natural environment, animals, and water. And if you look at this image, you'll see that this consists of 75 miles of that 2,000-mile long stretch, right? So US-Mexico border communities have been experienced what sociologist Timothy Dumm has described as low intensity conflict since the late 1970s. the people who live, work, go to school, and build families and community along the different cities and towns at this 2,000-mile-long stretch have witnessed the growing technologies, weaponry, border agents, and increasing militarization of the last 30 years, realities that impact border residents' mobility and livelihood. So for example, in 2010, border agents at the San Isidro port of entry beat and discharged a taser multiple times on Anastasio Hernandez Rojas, a longtime San Diego resident, which led to his untimely death. In June later that year, Sergio Adrián Hernández Huereca, a 15-year-old Mexican resident, was shot in the head by a border agent, even though Sergio was on the Mexican side of the border in Ciudad Juárez, and the agent was on the US side in El Paso. Again, in 2012, a border agent standing behind the border fence in Nogales, Arizona, shot and killed 16-year-old Jose Antonio Elena Rodriguez, who was walking along a sidewalk in Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. The agent claims he acted in self-defense against rock throwers on the other side. And these are just images that I took on a trip to the border just last year to document some of the ways in which Jose is being memorialized there in Nogales. Again, in this just last fall of 2020, David Angel Villalobos was killed by Border Patrol in San Isidro, who argued that he was attempting to make an unauthorized crossing into the United States. So these tragic events do not dissuade the anti-immigrant rhetoric that also fuels support for the enhanced border wall, which, from a human rights perspective, violates several international norms, including the rights of indigenous peoples, the right to private property, and the right to non-discrimination. Moreover, the wall has serious long-term environmental effects, but none of this is new. In 2008, 36 federal laws were waived thanks to the Real ID Act of 2005, which granted the Secretary of Homeland Security the authority to waive any law as is necessary to ensure expeditious construction of border barriers and related infrastructure. Currently, the Department of Homeland Security has waived 72 laws to build proposed sections of border wall in Arizona and California near national parklands. In 2011, the Surf Fence project was funded along the San Diego-Tijuana border, and this is an image that I have shared, that cost $4.3 million to further solidify a border barrier that extends 300 feet into the Pacific Ocean. The engineers believe that a steel fence can and will separate the ocean. Last year, they started ripping out the grandfather saguaro plants near Lukeville, Arizona, in the Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument for construction of the border wall. These saguaros can only be found in the Sonoran Desert. They grow only 1 inch in 10 years, and their lifespan is between 150 to 200 years. The devastation we feel here is palpable. O'odham land defenders have been arrested as they try and protect these sacred rights and sites. Yet the public does not hear about this in the national or international mainstream media, nor does it recognize the wall itself as illegal due to these violations. Furthermore, and what may be the biggest contradiction of the global market, just as capital and goods were able to freely cross North American national borders with the implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994, migrant bodies became increasingly policed under the Clinton administration's Operation Gatekeeper, which was in San Diego, in the San Diego-Tijuana corridor, and Operation Hold the Line, which was in the El Paso, Ciudad Juárez corridor. Of course, the unintended consequences of border militarization along these previously heavily trafficked areas in Southern California and Texas have funneled migrants into the deadly Sonoran Desert. This has led to an increase in deaths, with statistics showing that migrant deaths have doubled in the last 20 years in crossing the border. Since 1998, more than 7,216 men, women, and children have lost their lives while crossing the US-Mexico border, and in Arizona alone, at least 2,202 people have died in the last 10 years. So given these conditions, how is it that I propose an alternative mapping of the border? I'm not arguing that we should ignore these realities. In fact, it is imperative that we do not look away and we have an acute analysis of the continued colonial legacy affecting the border region. However, I am asking us to reimagine our framing. In other words, the border is seen as a static place defined only by the political boundary. However, what is often ignored are the experiences of border dwellers who, while marked by the political and economic policies decided by distant power holders, either in Mexico City or in Washington, D.C., they do make life happen in meaningful ways every day. So I set forward these questions with that in mind. How do these everyday practices differ from the information we are pummeled with in the media? News bites that render migrants as criminals and border residents as non-existent, a language that is directly tied to a culture that supports increased border enforcement at any cost and with any consequence, including the kidnapping of children and the separation of families, whether they be in cages or in facilities. How do we recognize the capacity and will of the human spirit to be defiant in the face of imposing boundaries and to show how intersecting culturas, geographies, and histories of the borderlands produce realities and experiences that must be named, understood, and recognized? The borderlands do not only bear an open wound, which I borrow from La Maestra Gloria Kaufman, but conscious community for the 82 million people who call it their home. So what I'd like to do this evening is introduce you to the work happening across two locations that I've been living and working in for the last 20 plus years, namely the San Diego-Tijuana corridor, which is Alta and Baja California, divided by the border, and then the Sonoran corridor, which includes Nogales, Mexico, Nogales, Arizona, Tucson, and then all the way up to Phoenix, right? So speaking from these places and centering the experiences of mujeres fronterizas or border women, I want to tell you about the creative strategies of resistance that have emerged in the borderlands. The three of them are: the first is the practice of autonomy, cross-border labor organizing, and border disruptions through socially engaged art, also known as artivism. Take a sip of water. So my study of autonomy on the border began in Tijuana when I met Hortensia Hernandez, a community leader and one of several women who have been fighting for the welfare and prosperity of their community called Maclovio Rojas. And you can see in this image a map that shows where Maclovio Rojas, the community, is situated. In reality, it is only but 8 miles from the division between the United States and Mexico. And in my conversations with Hortensia, she says, mi único delito es trabajar por la gente, which means my only crime is to work for the people. We were meeting on the patio of an unfamiliar home located in a new development in Tijuana, Mexico, and she told me this. This was one of our many clandestine meetings during her 6-year exile from the community that she helped to create since she was just 20 years old. In early 2000s, Maclovio Rojas was raided by local police who were responding to allegations of theft of water leveled by the local Department of Water and Power. Due to her role as a leader and organizer of the community, Hortensia's home was targeted and surrounded by the heavily armed police. She managed to evade arrest by fleeing and was forced into hiding for those years. 3 outstanding warrants for her arrest were issued at the time of the police raid. She says, my house was surrounded by the police as if I were the worst or best drug trafficker in the region. So this helps me reflect on who is criminalized and what activities are deemed criminal in the borderlands. Over the last 50 years, the United States-Mexico border region has experienced profound social, economic, and political shifts due to policies enacted by local and national governments, the implementation of international trade agreements, and shifts in population. Migrants are forced north out of the interior of Mexico, and sometimes, instead of making the treacherous journey across the desert, end up staying in border cities such as Tijuana. Despite poor labor conditions, Most of these migrant workers have little option but to seek employment in the maquiladoras run by the transnational companies, and I'll come to that next. Yet border cities lack the necessary infrastructure to meet the housing, healthcare, and educational needs of the growing population of workers, communities, families, children. So this is an image of the man, Maclovio Rojas, who was a migrant worker from the state of Oaxaca in Mexico, and who had migrated north to the San Quintin Valley in Baja California to work as a tomato picker in the fields. And he was encouraged to organize because of the conditions he found himself living in once he migrated. And through his organizing efforts had become a target. And in early 1987, he was killed by a local grower because of his organizing efforts. And so his name became known in the region, and there are actually other communities named after him, but namely this one, Maclovio Rojas, came together in 1988 when 25 families took over a land, national land that existed between the cities of what is known as Tecate and Tijuana, in hopes of establishing what was called an ejido, also known as a communal land. Now, let me explain a little bit about this complicated history of agrarian reform as it stands in Mexico. So after the Mexican Revolution, the 1917 Constitution was created and implemented. And according to the Mexican Constitution, peasant farm workers without lands would have access to national lands if they were not being productive. If the landowners, because at this time the distribution between land was great, and so if they were able to sit on the lands and become productive on them, within 5 years, those titles would be guaranteed and they could create these communal holdings. And this was in existence since the Constitution of 1917 until we fast forward to the sort of beginning of neoliberal exchanges and changes in Mexico. So in 1988, the president at the time, Salinas de Gortari, modified Article 27 in the Mexican Constitution, which allowed for the privatization of these national lands, which allowed for these multinational companies to come in and settle and to sell and buy land that wasn't in existence before. Again, this is what helped shape the shifting migratory patterns of many indigenous communities in Mexico and other rural communities. But this sort of happened at the precipice of the Maclovio Rojas land movement. Although they arrived to the community and settled on the lands well before the shift in the Constitution, they were denied access to the land grant and the entitlements because of this shift that happened. And so since 1988, since they landed, they have not been given the titles to their land. So their movement has been going on since then, right? And it's meant battling repressive strategies, such as the ones that I mentioned earlier about Hortensia being incarcerated. It has meant land invasions where they have to literally sit on the land and fight off invaders. And really it has meant living a life where there are no public services, such as schools, electricity, running water initially, right? They had to basically ensure that they created this for themselves. Despite the legal wrangling involved, the community has continued to grow since 1988. Now, when the leadership of Maclovio Rojas declared their settlement an autonomous one, they did so as a response to the denial of basic human services, both by the federal and state governments. In other words, in what I call in my forthcoming book, the space of neoliberal neglect, right? So organizing for basic services, education for their children, and healthcare was driven by necessity rather than an ideological and or explicitly political conviction. Hortensia has told me that necessity has made the community autonomous because although they have the same rights as Mexicans because they pay taxes, they're denied everything. If the government doesn't give them what they need, then they have to do it themselves. And she says, so we built our schools, we created a sports field, and we did it all working together. This is why we are autonomous. We haven't been given absolutely anything but problems. And so what I want to do is share some of the photos from this community as a way to demonstrate the ways in which they have materialized their experiences of autonomy along the US-Mexico border. So this was the entrance to Maclovio Rojas. The same signage doesn't exist today, but the M and the R obviously stand for Maclovio Rojas. This here is the Centro Cultural, or the community center, or the Aguascalientes, named in Aguascalientes in honor of the location of the Mexican Revolution, who in the early 1990s, when the Zapatista uprising happened in Chiapas, Mexico, they also created their own Aguascalientes, which were known as centers of political and social emancipation, a place where people could gather and take, if they didn't have land, they had a building in which they could gather and exchange ideas. And so in that vein, the leaders of Maclovio Rojas also created an Aguascalientes there in the town. This is just an image of the ways in which the community has to access power. As you can see, it's dangerous, but they access power through the generators that the city has connected to the surrounding industrial plants, right? So the maquiladoras, or the factories. And because they have been in litigation with the city around having access to electricity and power. This is one example of a school that was being built through donations, primarily from the United States, of materials. Here's another image of just some of the parents really coming together and creating a second school. There's a lot I can say about this, but I want to talk about some of the other projects. But as soon as they created their own schools, then they are able to submit a request, it's called a clave, to get recognition from the state. So then the children who are going to these schools will get their, primary schooling recognized by the state as well. But it took some time, and that was another battle. This is the Center for Women. This is an image of Cuauhtlicue, the goddess of fertility, that was rendered by one of a local artists from San Diego, from Mexico, but who resides in San Diego. And here, the Centro for the Women really is a place where women have come together for workshops, and also it's a place for childcare. So for many of the women who are part of this community, they still need to work in the maquiladoras. And so when they go to work, they're able to leave their children here for a nominal fee. And I wanted to show you a couple of the images of some of the murals in the community through the support of an organization that existed from the 80s all the way through the late 2000s, was BAUTAF, which is the Border Arts Workshop, or Taller de Arte Fronterizo, which came together to start drawing the oral histories from the women. And they created these beautiful murals in collaboration with the residents to basically tell the history of the community within the community itself and on their local walls. And so this is an example of a mural from the oral history of a woman who was one of the first settlers on the land, and who describes living with rattlesnakes, like she's waking up and discovering a rattlesnake was right next to her, and having to, figure out how to survive on the land. This is another one that describes how when it would rain, they would use a tarp to gather the rainwater so that they would have access to water during the day, so they could have access to water to clean, etc. So there's lots for me to say, and this is the subject of my forthcoming book, but I think that this example that the residents of Maclovio Rojas provide really demonstrates a shared commitment to collective action through the establishment and through the defense of what they call an autonomous community, right? And here, drawing on theorist and writer Holloway, the community of Maclovio Rojas shows us how this project of autonomy challenges, this idea of having power over, and instead creates power within, or power with, right? In community and through social relationships, that gives us insight on how we might be able to create the world that we want now. So shifting a bit to what I was describing as those industrial parks that surround communities like Maclovio Rojas, I want to share with you some other projects that I worked on where I examined how grassroots organizations are collaborating across borders, both binationally and locally, again in the San Diego-Tijuana border region, to create worker-centered spaces for change. Though the rapidly changing global economy causes constant shifts in production, stability, worker conditions, the maquiladora industry has consistently drawn migrant workers north for over 50 years. While the border economy depends on the maquiladora industry, the lives of the workers are deemed disposable. So I'm going to talk about 3 organizations: the Binational Feminist Collective, the Worker Rights Center, just briefly about all 3 of these, and the Network for Maquiladora Workers, right? So these are grassroots worker-centered spaces that challenge this notion of disposability and have really emerged as advocates for many workers seeking resolution to unjust working conditions in the region. They've created also an autonomous infrastructure. They're not union organizers, because there are unions that exist in these maquiladoras, but they're known as puppet unions, right? Because they are basically working in collusion with with the multinational company itself or the government. So in developing this sort of autonomous infrastructures, these groups offer legal support, worker rights workshops, and the opportunity for cross-border actions to pressure the transnational companies for whom they work. So I want to start by sharing, I'm going to give my phone because I realize I'm not aware of the time right now and I don't want to go over. But I wanted to share the story of a woman that I was able to interview, and her name was Vicky. Vicky was a worker in a factory that assembles cardboard boxes in Tijuana. She worked as a general assistant for 8 months. And at that time, she was asked to organize boxes on a high shelf because her own assembly line had slowed down. So she climbed this 48-step ladder and proceeded to do as asked. The next thing she remembered was waking up with a nurse by her side in the company infirmary. She had fallen from the top of the ladder and had been unconscious for 20 minutes. When she was asked to sit up, she felt a sharp pain in her back and was unable to feel her legs. As a result of the accident, Vicky became paralyzed from the waist down and suffers from dementia. The company she worked for claimed no responsibility for her fall, did not cover medical costs, and did not provide her and her family with severance pay for loss of work hours. After a desperate year of closed doors, the family turned to these grassroots organizations for assistance. And for Vicky, when she tells this story, it was the first time that her injuries were recognized and people were willing to advocate on her behalf. So these multinational companies that own the maquiladora industry, they thrive and maximize profits through the recruitment of cheap labor, the implementation of strict labor conduct rules, non-compliance with safety, environmental, and labor standards. The business practices create catastrophic environmental, health, and social problems that affect worker labor experiences. And of course, the consequences are exacerbated for border women and workers upon whom the conditions of structural violence weigh heavily, as they bear the greatest responsibility for alleviating these effects, right, as care workers. And although there have been some recent shifts, historically, women have comprised the larger part of the maquiladora workforce through strategic recruitment efforts due to a presumed level of dexterity and naivete. Currently in the city of Tijuana, there are 47 of these industrial parks, which each employ 200,000 workers in 2 12-hour shifts continue production 24 hours a day. It's a really great film called Maquilapolis. So like the Greek police and Maquila, if you want to look for it, that really documents this region very well. And although recently, if anybody saw in the news, the minimum wage has increased to $7, typically up until February of 2021, minimum wage was 54 pesos, which is about $4. And it's not an hour, but a day. So $4 a day. And in border cities like Tijuana, a gallon of milk costs approximately 45 pesos, which is about $3. So most maquiladora workers do not make more than $50 a week. Now, the impact of these dangerously low salaries on families is exacerbated by the humiliation they face at the factories for women. This often means they're required to a set of rules related to dress codes, bathroom use, breaks, and water consumption. I have been in company with workers who have shared with me they've been able to take these rules that they're given, and stuff it in their pants because they're not supposed to. And I've seen what they're required to do, which means sometimes they have to take random pregnancy tests to make sure that they're not pregnant. This also can mean revealing one's underwear to prove that they're having menstruation cycles. It also means sexual harassment by managers and those in power, supervisors. And so the conditions are extraordinary, right? And which is why the work of these organizations is so important to document. Now, this was the entrance to the worker center that I'm describing. And CITAC, with the Centro de Información de Trabajadores, what was interesting about what they did was that they actually drew upon Mexican federal labor law, that constitution that I was talking about earlier. Really, for its time and in present day society, it's actually really radical, and it has a lot of guarantees, or it had a lot of guarantees in there that were important for Mexican citizens, right? And so what they're now doing is they created a plan of action that draws on these federal labor laws to hold these transnational giants and corporations accountable. So again, I mean, many of these seem in some ways mundane to us, right? But the legal code does provide these parameters that include 8-hour workdays, vacation time, safety regulations, and essentially they're going back and using the law to fight for the rights of their own members. Now, none of these organizers are lawyers. They became lawyers through practice, right? I mean, and they're not actually lawyers, but they're able to defend themselves in these labor courts to support these workers. Now, while CITAC has addressed the needs of all workers, and in fact was the first to combat and win in the early 1990s a sexual harassment case for a maquiladora worker, a group that also highlights the needs of women workers and border dwellers is the Colectiva Feminista Binacional, so the Binational Feminist Collective, which was formed in 2004, and it was in existence for over 10 years. And it basically consisted of women from both sides of the border who define themselves as students, teachers, zapatistas, chicanas, mexicanas. Their mission was to help construct a new movement that supports and highlights the spiritual and human components to the diverse struggles experienced by women in the border region. Although these women had been working together in other projects over many years, they hadn't necessarily worked together and collaborated. But in 2004, I think they all started to really feel the weight of NAFTA. At this time, it had been in existence for 10 years. These conditions in which they found themselves became more visible, and they realized that these policies had created pressure on women through lower salaries, sexual harassment, constant threat of unemployment, contamination, et cetera, right? And these affect their communities as well as their roles as mothers, wives, and community members. So they decided to work collectively, and they did a few things in order to build this network, right? And so the first thing they did was they hosted an encuentro, and they actually did it in the community of Maclovio Rojas. They looked at how they could see the ties that existed between communities, and they recognize that if they were able to share these organizing experiences, that they could create something that hadn't existed before. They wanted to discuss solutions, and in this way, they really were generated so many experiences and lessons with one another, right? So they also started organizing these workshops in which they could train each other on their rights as workers, their rights as women, and even environmental rights. And through the relationships that they established, perhaps there was a doctor on the US side, or on the Mexican side, there was a medicine who knew the health and wealth of plantitas, of hierbas, of plants, right? And so they also then started using like cross-border organizing tactics, which means, for example, if there was a maquiladora on the Mexican side that suddenly closed down, and this happened more than I can tell you, they were able to have a protest maybe on the Mexican side, and then on the US side also host a protest maybe at the consulate. Or in one case, one of the owners of one of these factories happened to live in a wealthy neighborhood in San Diego, and they were able to track down his address, and they were able to host a protest in front of his house, right? And he was having a barbecue that day, and so the workers sort of laughed at that, right? That they were able to bring visibility to these issues. So what Colectiva Feminista demonstrates is that women border dwellers, activists, really start to see a broader definition of community, right? They are allowed to see the commonalities across geopolitical borders. They are able to see their own concerns, that they shared land and housing issues, access to public services, the racialization of environmental health. They were also able to see how the transnational companies and the global market affected them in the same ways. And so it was important to understand how they can create this solidarity across borders. And they also shared victories, which I think is an important thing to make note of. The campaigns against transnational companies, the coalition building that came in learning and in building relationships with one another. And in an environmental such as the maquiladoras, where women are stripped of humanity and encouraged to compete against one another, the very same workers not only to work to restore humanity and rights in the workplace, but support each other in their shared and individual fights. So had it not been for CITAC and the Colectiva Feminista, Vicky, the woman I began the story about, would not have had her right to medical care restored, nor would she have become a leader in the worker rights movement. And their stories and lives are really important to acknowledge. So I'm sorry, I forgot to transition to that next slide. So I want to go into, and I saw something coming in. So but I didn't get, I don't have the chat function open. So if you need to get a hold of me, just holler. But I saw something coming through, but I don't know what it was. So moving into my third area, I've lived in the state of Arizona for the last 15 years, during a time when state and local politics were rapidly responding to these shifting demographics caused by global economic policies, right? And so because of those increasing numbers of migrants coming through the Sonoran borderlands, we had national calls for border enforcement, and that have been taken up by the state. So as a result, there has been a strategically fashioned climate of fear and dehumanization of Mexican, Chicanx, indigenous migrants by local politicians who have in many ways been quite successful at codifying this through law and popular consciousness with brutal launches of legislative powers. Due to the funneling effect and increased migrant crossing and the historical conservatism of the state, the Arizona legislature introduced many anti-immigrant bills over the course of several years. Two most widely known are SB 1070, the Show Me Your Papers bill, and HB 2281, the Ethnic Studies bill. Moreover, federal policies like 287G allowed local governments to collude with federal policies on immigration enforcement, workforce raids, police brutality, and mass detention incarceration, which in Maricopa County, which is also known as Phoenix, became known as the Reign of Terror caused by former Sheriff Joe Arpaio. And of course, this is an image of a mask of his face. And so much of my research has then now shifted to this border region. And I've been focused on documenting and making visible the stories of communities and workers responding, organizing, and thriving despite these conditions. So one project that I looked at was the Worker Rights Center in Phoenix, where workers were organizing against wage theft. And if I may, I would like to show the video that we created. Can you still see my screen, or do I have to stop share and reshare before I start playing?
Yeah, we can still see the screen.
Thank you. Sorry. Okay.
Hang on, I think you can see the PowerPoint.
Got it. So you can't, okay. Sorry about that. I thought I had done it so I could show everything. Let me, okay, can you see a documentary now?
Yes, yep.
Okay, thank you. All right, so.
Un caballero trabajó en landscaping. Había un muchacho que no me quería pagar y me estuve informando para ver cómo le hacía yo para que me pudieran pagar y me dijeron del Centro de Derechos Laborales y es como fui a dar ahí.
When we opened the Worker Rights Center in August of 2008, we initially were doing labor rights education because a lot of people were misinformed about what their rights were.
La gente que no puede, que no sabe sus derechos, como nosotros no lo sabíamos. Cuando nosotros llegamos, pues llegamos prácticamente sin saber nada también.
In the over 300 cases that we've documented of workplace abuse here in Phoenix, we've documented over $1 million of unpaid back wages, and we've been able to collect about $230,000 since we opened. This number is not indicative of the scope of the problem here in Phoenix. It was educating people about rights around discrimination, health and safety, workers' compensation.
We'll help them file with the Department of Labor or the court, whatever the case may be, to help them get their money back. From that very first interview with people, we say, this sucks that this happened to you, that you didn't get paid. We're trying to get your money back, but we ask that you join this organization because unfortunately, it is really common what's happening to you.
So there was an accumulation of these laws and dehumanizing policies that the center exists within.
Uno ya no se siente libre de andar por las calles, uno pues se siente uno un poco mal, ¿verdad? Aparte de que, por ejemplo, este es mi trabajo, aparte de que me bajó mucho, por ejemplo, la venta porque los clientes no quieren comprar como antes.
Que ni siquiera se atrevía a decir ni siquiera su nombre completo. Entonces hemos visto que con las clases de liderazgo la gente se va desplayando y vas perdiendo la vergüenza, vas agarrando confianza cuando tú ya puedes hablar en público, ya puedes estar en cualquier tipo de reuniones. O sea, son cosas que a lo mejor para otra persona son insignificantes, pero para nosotros, al menos para mí, me han beneficiado mucho porque te han hecho agarrar confianza y seguir adelante y ayudar a más gente que tú ves que está viviendo la misma situación que por la que yo pasé.
So the Worker Rights Center really came into existence and supported the workers in the region for 10 years. In 2016, it closed its doors, sadly so because of defunding and then the politics in the state. But it's really, I think, I want to acknowledge so that that work that happened and started happening, that communities weren't passive observers to what was happening in the state, right? And they immediately started creating community and organizing together. And I think that this really led to, or really paved the way for the shift in electoral politics that happened just this last November, right? And so let me go back to my other screen. Okay. And so this incendiary rhetoric in popular media that directly impacts the embodied experiences of vulnerable communities, especially migrants, really shows how communities who are responding to it have to push back against this culture of fear. Now, I also, though, want to focus on the ways in which women, in particular, are simultaneously demonized and erased in this public imaginary that has been created, right? Their images deformed, sanitized, and or homogenized. Really, what this underscored for us was the urgency for a measured, coherent feminist response to what was happening in the state. And I really think that two projects have emerged as a response. One, the Entre Nosotras Collective, which I will talk about, and then the Binational Arts in Residence project that I'll end my talk about. And these two projects use what Marta Gonzalez calls artivism, right, which is art and activism, and to engage in social dialogue and in change. So so the Entre Nosotras Collective really was a group that was publicly active starting in 2012 through 2015. And interestingly, I was talking earlier this morning about my work in the classroom and how I see, my research as accompaniment and how I use, pedagogy to shift, to do social transformation work in the academy. And so this project really emerges from a class that I used to teach called Gender in the Borderlands. And I think after a 15-week session of learning of many of the things that I'm talking about tonight, my students felt compelled to do something about it and to sort of try and make a change in the landscape of the region in which they were living, because this is sort of at the height of SB 1070, HB 2281, and many other legislative propositions that came forward during this time. And so in collaboration with other faculty members and other community members, we really were thinking about a project that focused on feminist pedagogy and horizontal leadership. And, and as I said, we really were thinking about how could we transform Arizona's socio-political landscape. And so our work intersected academic inquiry, arts activism, and our goals were to refocus debates about culture in its broadest conception, to bridge perceived communication gaps in our community, and to create new audiences and venues for the exhibition of work by women artists who were critically reflecting on their own positions as women of color, Latinxes, Chicanxes, Indigenous, Afro-descendants, and Mestizas. And we enacted community engagement through the deliberate crossing between and across elite university spaces, right? And popular community spaces that house social justice organizations. So we did many things over the course of our 4 or 5 years together, including film screenings, master classes, and I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it because I do want to talk about BNR, but I'll just go through some of the slides so you can see some of the work that we did during this time in community and across spaces. We actually curated one of the first ever Arizona-based art show that focused on Indigenous, Latina, and Chicana women who were thinking about their identities in the state through their visual art, right? And so we created this show. We did workshops, in community. And before I end, I want to just talk a little bit about a couple of components of this work that I think really respond to this notion of resistance, insistence, and belonging in the borderlands, both geographically and symbolically, as we moved between, the academy and community spaces. And so the first really was this idea of dialogue, right? Using art to stimulate dialogue as a way of indirectly talking about issues and having conversations about race, class, gender, sexuality, migration. And as one member, I won't forget, she said, it's easier to invite maybe my conservative aunt who lives out in the suburbs to an art show and then engage in the discussion that emerges because of this art show than it is to say, hey, let's have a conversation about racism or white supremacy, right? And the other component that I think has a common thread in a lot of this work that I'm discussing about is the notion of autonomy and horizontal leadership. Now, even though we operated in this model of horizontal leadership, we also tried to think thoughtfully about how we navigated the institutions that we formed part of. So, the university funding institutions really couldn't, and we didn't want them to dictate what we could and couldn't do, that we still shaped the work that we did from beginning to end. And as people who identify as women of color, and as feminists, right? So that was really important to us. So the question that we sort of held on to was, how do we dynamically hold on to this autonomy through our work? And so because of various factors, the work folded for, I think about 2 or 3 years ago, but I really gave rise to, I think, a lot of other movements that now exist in the region. Which leads me to this last project that I want to talk about, which is the Binational Arts Residency. This project began with the idea of connecting cultural communities in the Sonoran Desert with issues of social justice, history, identity, through art. Over the course of the residency, artists, cultural workers, and students collaborate to create artistic workshops, performances, and public talks in these communities that sometimes don't necessarily have access to this, right? So we might go to the O'odham Nation, we might go to Nogales, Sonora, or even to Douglas, Arizona, right? And this organization, our organization, starts working within these communities. And through this work, we center women of color artists, and it's really an initiative that is drawn and created by women leaders, right? And so this image, I wanted to sort of highlight how we imagine this Sonoran corridor, right? So if you can see, we want to amplify the cultural flows and think about social justice through this work. But when you look at this image of the constellation here, right? So you think about the top point as being Phoenix, and then the bottom point as being Hermosillo, we can think of the borderlands as a constellation as opposed to a division between two, nations and between cities, right? And I think that, through this work, we've been able to foster a deeper understanding of history, place, migration, identity in the Sonoran Desert, and to cultivate dialogues on social and political issues about borders. And one of the artists that we brought in, Ana Teresa Fernandez, really did some really fascinating work with us. And so there's a really great video that, now let me stop sharing, let me do this right this time. And I will show you the video. Okay.
La idea es como que tener la continuación del cielo, como si fuera un telón, ¿no? Que se pone enfrente. Entonces, cuando uno está, y lo hicimos precisamente aquí en este espacio, porque hay una calle que continúa, o sea, que empieza en México y continúa en Estados Unidos, pero hay esta frontera, esta barrera que impide el movimiento, ¿no? A través de esta calle. Entonces, creando como que la sensación como si nada más estuviera el cielo. qué no ver este espacio como si fuéramos una humanidad? No somos dos culturas, digo, sí somos diferentes culturas, pero es bajo el mismo cielo, ¿no? Entonces como que una unidad y traer o crear esa sensación de unión.
So that was one of our, that was one of our artists. And over the course of, I encourage you to, if you have interest in this project, I encourage you to look at our website by nationalartsresidency.com because it demonstrates the artists that have come and sort of the acts that we've done along the border and really trying to disrupt the border. And then this image that I shared with you, this is what we did in Agua Prieta, Sonora, and in Mexico. And then she had originally done it, sorry, it's so blurry, in Tijuana, right? And so this is, I think, an image I took, which is probably why it's so blurry. One time when I was visiting the San Diego, Tijuana region, right? And this is an image of Ana Teresa up there doing the work, right? And so, you know, my goal here today, after sharing all of these stories, is really to ask you to think of the US-Mexico border and the borderlands not just as a place that people pass, right? But as a place and a space of feminist resistance, conviviality, agency, and creative community building. The work that is done through these collective spaces remind ourselves of our interconnectedness, to be in and model non-hierarchical communities, to build relationships with one another, to utilize collective and public pedagogies, to build power with and not over, and to create maybe even temporary autonomous spaces. Right? Organizing autonomously and in collectives build solidarity in ways that decenter the institutions and the nation states and instead center directly impacted communities. Now, how do we behave in the day-to-day as much as possible in a way that we envision the world? I would believe that empire and capital isn't totalizing. And I believe we can deepen the grietas, that's what the Zapatistas call it, or the cracks, right? The cracks that exist in the state and that the state and capital hasn't been able to occupy. Instead, we occupy those spaces and we connect them in order to further unravel the layered systems of domination, capital, patriarchy, oppression. I had a great professor when I was at Columbia University, Maxine Gray. She was an educational philosopher, and she used to ask us, how do we imagine the unimaginable? I'll end there. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Téllez, for a really, really inspiring talk. And so I do want to open it up for questions. Please don't be shy. Put questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to have my colleague, Dr. Louise Collins, help me moderate the discussion. So let me start us out with the first question here that was asked, and that is, what is the first, and in your opinion, the most important action that the Biden administration should take in order to address this huge question of inequity in the borderlands?
Take kids out of cages. Take them out of facilities. I mean, reunite families today, yesterday. I mean, that is fundamentally what has to happen as a first step. Yeah, and then, I mean, this is why we elect these officials, to make humane decisions, right? And with the help of community members, and to think about the border communities that are having to face the consequences of their actions, right? The increased militarization, what does that mean for border communities? And to really take note and perhaps do a border tour with people who are directly affected by their policies. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Well, we've got another question, which is prefaced by the comment, what inspiring work? Thank you. And the question is, could you say a little bit more about your methods and how challenging or not it is to connect to local organizers? Are you always seen as an ally? Are there worries that you are both an insider and an outsider as an academic?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, no, this is an interesting comment. And I was talking a little bit about this earlier about how I really am trying to disrupt this notion that, you know, we are the researchers and they are the subjects, and that we have this sort of, and that I don't have this positivist perspective when it comes to research, right? I do believe in research for social transformation. I do believe in research as accompaniment. And I don't believe in going into communities where you're extracting, you know, like as in extractive research. And so typically, I find myself engaging in relationships and building from those communities and those relationships, and then figuring out that we should probably figure out a way to tell this story, right? And so I'm an ethnographer, and that's the way I have done it. Now, have there been times that I've struggled with this position? Absolutely. And there are bigger projects that I've then, you know, gone on to do where the methodologies are a little bit different from what I've done in the past, you know, like when you have to do surveys of thousands of people, it's impossible to have relationships with them, but some meaningful data can come from those surveys as well. You know, when I was a graduate student, I did come across this problem when I was trying to do my first ethnography, and I was living in the city of New York. And immediately I was connected to many of the organizers who were doing work that I was doing, like around autonomy and Zapatista support systems, et cetera. And once I took my first ethnography class and I realized that I wanted to write about the shifting demographics in Spanish Harlem, I was encouraged by some of the residents. But then I was met with a lot of pushback from some of the community leaders who were not necessarily from Spanish Harlem, but were organizing in that community. And they felt that I had come in and like built these relationships and then decided to write about them. And so that was tricky. And it was a good reminder to me to think deeply about why I'm doing certain projects and what I hope that comes out of it. And so I really believe it's really hard, but I really believe in engaging with research with community members, right? And so most of the projects that I've done, I've, you know, sent back some of the information that I'm writing about, like, what do you think about this? Am I conveying this story accurately? And that comes with challenges, you know, but I see myself primarily as an ethnographer of the particular. And I think that we don't necessarily have access to the kinds of stories that I would have access to. So I think it's imperative that I put them out there in community with others. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have a question that is prefaced with an apology that the person asking lost her connection for the last 10 minutes, but she was really intrigued by the action plan slide that you presented. And in studying feminist manifestos this semester, I've noticed that the action plan is similar to what we're studying. How is this action plan being used actively right now? And what organization or organizations are supporting it? And how is it being publicized?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. So the CITAC and the Colectiva Feminista was a project that ended in about 4 years ago, but it was in existence for 20 years. And the plan, like as I mentioned, drew from federal labor law and was, and so what they were trying to demonstrate was that the you know, like the nation state already had a response, right? And all we had to do was like abide by the law. And how they were able to disseminate information about it was that they there's a place in Tijuana called the Cinco y Diez. So it's like a place where all the buses come, right? And so this is where a lot of workers line up to go take the bus to their respective job places. And so what they created really, fantastically is they created what they called first aid, worker rights first aid kits. And they were, I wish I had one. I have one on a slide, but I didn't share it. It was like a very small sort of brochure, I guess, where they folded it up small enough so that nobody would notice that they had access to it, right? And so they would come and they would kind of pass these out really, on the down low. And then whenever the worker was able to open it, they would see it as action plans. And then that would make them pause and say, wait, I'm not getting 8-hour work days, or I'm not allowed to take these bathroom breaks, right? And so that is one methodology that they would utilize to spread the information. And then they would have the information of the worker center on there so that they could call and maybe be in contact, right? But a lot of workers are scared. A lot of workers are scared. A lot of workers and a lot of these organizers are blacklisted. And while, the ways in which organizing has shifted along the borderlands because of the shifting migratory patterns, right? They're still organizing, but that action plan, I think, isn't being utilized in the same way as it had been. Because there was some shifts like NAFTA, we had a US president that wasn't necessarily in support of it in the same way as, the technocrats of days past. And so I think that it is sort of yet to be seen the impact of the last 4 years on how people are organizing. I think there was a shift towards survival, right, in the borderlands because of the rapidly increasing arrival of migrants from Central America and from other parts of the world.
Thank you.
So we've got another question that asks you, please, to comment on the current state of cross-border interactions under COVID circumstances. And specifically, other than ubiquitous reports on illegal migration, there's very little information in national media regarding the impact of border closures on local communities.
Yeah, no, the impact has been wide felt. It's a great question. I mean, this moment historically is very unique, right? And I'm barely beginning a project, as you all mentioned. We got this grant from the Canadian Institute of Research Health that looks at the impact of COVID, not only on Indigenous communities, but what they call newcomers in Canada, what we call migrant communities. And so we're going to be starting this spring interviews with migrant communities in this region, like specifically the Sonoran Corridor. So I hope I will have a little bit more information about that then. But just thinking about the impact, well, the border has been closed for a year. I mean, Mexican non-residents, US non-residents, and those without visas are not allowed to cross into the United States. And we know that because there is a lot of capital exchange and cultural exchange, and it has separated families, it has slowed down how people survive along the border in terms of commerce. But there continues to be interesting ways in which people try to find community. So for example, here in Nogales, Arizona, and then Nogales, Sonora, there's a point on the border wall where on this side, the land sort of is like a little hill that people have been standing on. And then on the Mexican side, they come up on the other side in the street, so they're able to communicate with family members across the border, right? And so, these are the ways in which they've continued to try to see each other. Unfortunately, down in the San Diego, Tijuana region, there used to be a place called the Borderfield State Park. Well, the park is still there, but it used to be a monument to friendship between Mexico and the United States. But because of the increasing enforcement and militarization, the park has really been closed down to public access. I mean, there's very few times where you can sort of arrive there, but that used to be a place when I was living in the 90s in Mexico, in San Diego, and sometimes in Mexico. We used to have concerts, like binational concerts. You could be on one side of the border and be listening to a concert on the other side. Yoga, you can have one class on one side and be on the other side. And so, so I think that we don't know yet the effects and the impacts of this current conjuncture. And that's the best that I can say right now.
Thank you. We also have a question about engaging religious communities. And more specifically, the question is, how have you been engaging religious communities in this work in order to build a more meaningful dialogue about the role of Christianity and the work of the church in the creation of social justice in people's day-to-day life at the border. Do you feel that church Christianity has been present in these struggles?
Absolutely. Yeah, that was actually a big lesson for me moving to the Sonoran corridor from, the California region, in that Arizona was the place where the sanctuary movement was basically born in the 1980s, in support of Central American refugees, right? And that was born in the churches, in the Christian churches. And so, and then the Kino Border Initiative here in the Nogales region also is a big humanitarian aid support group for migrants that have been either recently deported or recently arrival. They have a soup kitchen. They have shelter for women, because we know that women are oftentimes assaulted in their journeys across the border. I mean, it's a tremendous human rights issue that we face and we continue to face. And in fact, in 2011, so 10 years ago, I was invited to a human rights forum where there was a bishop, Ramon Vera, his name, and he had run the RAFTO Award for Human Rights, which is sort of like the precursor. If you get the RAFTO, sometimes you get the Nobel Peace Prize too. And he had a workshop in Saltillo, which is another border city that's a little bit more east. And it was all of the human rights organizations that were all rooted in they were Jesuits, mostly Jesuits, Christian Catholic Jesuits, and who were doing the work of supporting migrants along the treacherous route, right? Because at every juncture of the journey, they were met either with state repression, or from, those were the criminals who were trying to exploit the migrants in the crossing. And so it was a really an insider look for me to see the work that the church has been doing in these communities along the way. So yeah, the human rights work of the Jesuits has been really important, and many of the shelters that exist along the border are supported by the local churches. And so it's we have to think about the long history, of like the colonial legacy of conquest and Christianity and what it has done to indigenous communities across the Americas, with also contemporary analysis of some of the good that has happened and some of the humanitarian work that has come from these churches, right? But this is not necessarily my area of study. It's mostly in practice and my experience that I know of them.
Thank you.
So somebody has wanted to express not so much a question as a comment, thanking you for a talk that very strongly resonated with this person, who indicates that she's Chicana and grew up along the borderlands, and as a child used to cross the border a lot, never really had a word to describe what it was to live in the borderlands region, and would spend a lot of time crossing back and forth. And so is finding this idea of Fronteriza really impactful, and thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that comment. I appreciate that. I'm sorry I'm not looking at the questions right now, but I appreciate it, and feel free to call me or email me if I can support you.
Thank you.
We also have another question that, first of all, thanks you for an amazing presentation. And then the question is, if you could speak more about the importance of decolonizing the borderlands, specifically in regard to the daily sexual and gendered violence that Fronterizas experience due to the hyper-militarization of the region.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wish I had a very specific answer around that. But I think that some of the work that I highlight has that decolonial lens as an imperative, right? It is about understanding the long history of conquest and how that affects and informs the ways in which women's bodies continue to be sexualized, hypersexualized along the border. But in understanding that history and in building relationships across the board and in thinking about ways to respond, we can begin to dismantle or to disrupt these long histories of conquest at the border. And I mean, I think that centering you know, so that's a lot of the work that I've done here in Arizona, especially with the Binational Arts Residency and Entre Nosotras, has really centered the leadership of women, right? And I think that we bring a different kind of lens and analysis to the work when women are centered, right? And so it's a long process. I don't expect that things will shift anytime soon, but I do think that there are communities and there are people who recognize that change has to happen, right? And if it's not, and if it doesn't have this intersectional lens, and if it doesn't have a commitment around recognizing the impact that our long history of conflicts has had on the border regions, then it won't really change much, right? And there's some that argue that globalization is a continuation of, you know, of colonialism, right? It's in a new iteration. And so all the ways in which people are organizing against these transnational companies, you know, feels sometimes as if you're, you know, you're fighting the latifundios and those that existed in these colonial times, right? And so that's my best answer for now.
Thank you.
Again, a question that begins with a thank you and an acknowledgement of the importance of the work. Do you have any strategies how you and others could encourage migrants to move further east, perhaps South Bend, Elkhart, Indiana? We're a belonging community. In fact, IU South Bend is growing to be recognized as a growing Hispanic Latino population with designation as such.
I'm sorry, so the question is how to encourage migrants to move to different places?
Here, perhaps.
Here, well. Yeah,
how can you become a welcoming community?
I love that, yeah.
What might that look like?
Yeah, what would that look like? You know, I mean, I think there have been certain cities that have issued a proclamation to become sanctuary cities, right? And so that they don't enforce federal policies around immigration. So that's one idea. You know, having like safe spaces for people to arrive to, I think is very important. And I think that honestly, the networks already exist within migrant communities. And so people arrive to places that they know and that other people have already gone through. I mean, they're underground networks that you and I may not know, actually. And so if a place is, you know, if there's work and there's a place to live and there's people already there, people in their hometowns are going to have access to that information and will start coming and landing in these different places. And so, but as a city or as a, you know, in the United States, the sanctuary clause is something that's very big, and also creating a place like a shelter for recent arrivals is very interesting as well. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. And then we actually have one final question, which is going to work out perfectly in the interest of time here. And I'm just going to read the question, and it reads, thank you for your work. As a trans-fronteriza growing up in Mexicali, Calixto border, I wanted to acknowledge how important it is for you to speak from your location as a trans-fronteriza and border feminist. In witnessing so much structural violence against workers, have you ever felt at a loss for words in explaining the violence? And if you do, how do you get yourself back to writing, speaking, and mobilizing?
That's a tough question. Thank you for that question. Many times over the course of my career that I've felt the brunt of, or the weight of the stories that I have witnessed or been, you know, or was given, you know. And so I think in those moments when it has felt overwhelming, we have to, you know, Paulo Freire, I learned from Paulo Freire that, you know, sometimes you have to take a step away from either it's the social movement work, it's the teaching, it's the radical pedagogy, and have some time to reflect, and as a way to have a better analysis of the situation, you know. And so that luckily I really do credit, my work as an emergency credential teacher in California so many years ago, and introduced me to this work as a way to help me in the next 20 years of my career, to remember that stepping away and reflecting is part of the work as well. And there's a whole movement now around self-care, which I think is important, but for me it has to be care rooted in community, and rooted in my culture, and rooted in the relationships that I have with people that I care about. And so all that is the places that I find joy, and also to remember that we've been fighting for hundreds of years. Our ancestors, our families have been fighting for hundreds of years, the conditions in which they find themselves, but they've also found joy, right? And found ways to survive and live. And so it's that, the dialect of joy and pain that we as humans are trying to, ever balance. And so for me, that applies as well, right? And so I feel it's an honor to carry some of these stories and experiences, and then it's an obligation to take care of those that I'm close to. And so that might mean taking a break from the work. And that has happened. That has definitely happened. So thank you.
Okay, so it's already after 8 o'clock. I want to thank you, Dr. Téllez, for being here tonight and for such an inspiring and wonderful lecture. I have to say, I've learned a lot. I know many other people in the audience, I'm sure, have too. And I can't wait to see more of you and your activism, especially once COVID restrictions are over and we can actually be together in person again. So thank you so much. And let's give Dr. Téllez a virtual hand here as an applause. And thank you also to the audience for being here and for your questions.
Thank you all so very much for everything. I'm honored, and I hope that we can continue these conversations.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.